Egypt, in the time of the pharaohs, a rich and powerful empire. But the people of Israel live in slavery, oppressed by a tyrannical pharaoh. To win their freedom, Moses sends 10 plagues on Pharaoh's land. As God's fury, they sweep over Egypt. The plagues bring desolation, disease, and death. At least according to the Bible. Are they just legends? Or did these events really happen? The waters of the Nile turn to blood. Fish die, frogs invade the land, insects attack man and beast. Disease follows. Are these biblical plagues real disasters from the past, held in the memory of the peoples who lived through them? Scientists excavating an ancient Egyptian city have remarkable evidence that climate change could have been the cause of the Bible plagues. Biologists see evidence of a natural chain reaction. What did happen on the Nile 3,000 years ago? Jerusalem, 700 years before Christ. In the thriving capital city of the Israelites, there's a spirit of religious renewal. In the new writing schools and scriptoria of the temples, Hebrew scholars are combining ancient texts and folk memories to form an epoch-making work. It is the birth of the Holy Scriptures. This is where the scholars author the story of the 10 plagues. A central event in a great epic, a radical new account of revelation and creation. A new God appears on the stage of faith. He reveals himself to Moses in the shape of a burning bush. One and almighty, the God Yahweh. He chooses Moses as his prophet and the people of Israel as his people. In Egypt, the Israelites live as slaves in the service of the Pharaoh. God has promised them freedom and a homeland, and gives Moses the task of leading them from slavery into the land of Israel. It's an arduous and wondrous journey that the Bible describes. The book of Exodus captured this story in words. We don't know what ancient accounts inspired the scribes. They themselves dated the original stories far before their own time. At their center is the heroic figure of Moses. As God's prophet, he demands that the Pharaoh release his people. Signs and miracles are to demonstrate God's power. At his command, Aaron's rod turns into a snake before the Egyptian ruler. The duel, the test of strength, is opened. The godlike Pharaoh is not impressed. His own magicians are just as powerful. When the two snakes do battle and Moses' snake wins, Pharaoh does not admit defeat. The Bible says he hardens his heart and refuses to let the people of Israel go. It's not possible to confirm the Bible stories historically, because Moses' opponent, the Pharaoh, is never given a name. But there is a hint to the location of the action in the mention of two ancient Egyptian cities, Pithom and Ramses.
It's interesting that in the biblical account of the Exodus, the Pharaoh has no name. But the first chapter of Exodus names two cities, Pithom and Ramses. So it's quite possible the authors were thinking of P. Ramses, once the capital of Egypt, when they wrote this account.
P. Ramses was a great metropolis on the Nile Delta. But this city, the biblical city of Ramses, suddenly disappeared off the map in ancient times and was only rediscovered at the end of the 20th century. Its downfall has long puzzled archaeologists and historians. Was it caused by natural disasters? Egypt, the Nile Delta. While excavating the area around Cantir in the 1990s, archaeologist Edgar Pusch found the foundations of the city of Ramses.
We came here to find out whether our theories were right, that this is the location of Ramses City. We were sure they were correct, but there was no proof. The sign on the city gates, an entry sign, you are entering the city of Ramses, that simply doesn't exist.
Cantir in the Nile Delta, 1996. Edgar's team scanned the surface with a cesium magnetometer, one strip at a time. This technique can trace the remains of ancient buildings 5 meters underground. It provides a kind of X-ray of long-vanished constructions. When the pictures were analyzed, the results were sensational. They'd discovered an entire unknown city, with broad avenues and narrow alleyways, wealthy villa districts, crowded workers' quarters, temples and palace complexes. And it was seriously big.
This city extends over an area of 30 square kilometers. Several branches of the Pelusian arm of the Nile once flowed through it. It was without doubt a fabulously wealthy city. The Anastasi Papyrus tells us in its Hymn of Splendor that everyone wanted to live there.
The great pharaoh Ramses II has given his own name to the legendary city of Ramses. Its prime position on the Nile makes it a powerful attraction to merchants and travelers. A tourist reports enthusiastically to a friend back home.
This is a wonderful place to stay. The countryside hereabouts is full of good things. There are onions, lettuce, pomegranates, olives, figs, and sweet wine. Everyone is happy, and no one says, if I could only have. The common people are doing just as well as the rich people.
P. Ramses seems to be a paradise. There are no records of a crisis here, or a series of plagues. And yet this city would experience a disaster that would change everything. Here, beside the sacred river, P. Ramses was built for eternity. The Nile guaranteed the city's future. All along its length, the ancient Egyptians worshipped the river. Its waters made the desert bloom. All life was connected with it. The Bible tells how Moses summons the first plague with one stroke of his rod on the waters. This first plague strikes the Egyptians at their most vulnerable point. Their current of life transformed into a tide of death. The Nile turns red, begins to stink, and becomes undrinkable. Just as the god Yahweh had predicted, all the waters of Egypt turned to blood. The drinking water is contaminated. The fish die.
The plague stories, plagues 1 to 9, reflect knowledge gained through experience. We'd call it experiential scientific knowledge, combined with expert guesswork. At the Jerusalem Temple School, they were taking phenomena they knew happened, and they knew happened rarely, and were trying to explain them.
The Nile turning murky or red was nothing new for the people of Egypt. Desert sandstorms would deposit red dust on the water's surface. And with each annual flood, red earth from the highlands of Ethiopia was swept into the river. These were hardly catastrophes. But if the river should ever be contaminated, that would spell disaster for an entire way of life. At Berlin's Leibniz Institute for Water Ecology and Inland Fisheries, they study the complex interaction of ecological systems. The hydrologists here believe that the first plague, the contamination of the Nile, may have been caused by an infestation of poisonous blue algae. They even have a prime suspect. They're investigating the properties of burgundy blood algae, actually a bacterium, and it fits the bill better than any other algae. It thrives in fresh water. We know it existed 3,000 years ago. It's highly toxic, and it's red. Biologist Stefan Pflugmacher is intrigued by the chance to solve an ancient mystery.
One possible explanation for the red coloring of the Nile is the appearance of burgundy blood algae, Oscillatoria rubescens, a beautiful raspberry-colored species of cyanobacteria. It multiplies massively in slow-moving warm waters with high levels of nutrition, and as it dies, it stains the water red.
Off the coast of western Florida, they encounter a similar phenomenon. They regularly see dangerous algae blooms with disastrous effects. This toxic display is known as the red tide. The algae isn't always red. In deeper waters, it's colorless. So the scientists have to take samples at different levels and in different locations to check how widely the deadly bacteria has spread. Alan Chembella is one of the world's leading toxic algae researchers.
In some cases, the algae form a superficial layer on top of the water. That's a so-called classic red tide, where you can actually see water discoloration. But much more often, the bloom is in fact subsurface. You can't see anything from looking with your naked eye into the water column.
These algae are called Corania brevis. They're hundredths of a millimeter long, aggressive, toxic algae that give off a nerve gas. The scientists have found more than 1 million per litre in their samples. A Corania bloom can last for weeks or months, even up to a year. Today, more than 60 species of toxic algae have been identified in our oceans, lakes and rivers. And there's nothing we can do about them.
The algae evolved presumably hundreds of millions of years ago. They're not new. They occurred before human beings were here and probably will be there long after human beings are gone from the face of the earth.
A plague of algae could have occurred at any time in the past, and certainly on the ancient Egyptian Nile. The first biblical plague ends after 7 days. The god Yahweh's first triumph over Pharaoh and all his gods. Like Hapi, the river god in whom the Egyptians worshipped the sacred Nile. This great statue, sunk in the Mediterranean off the coast of Alexandria, is proof of his importance. Hapi, mighty ruler of the Nile, one of the greatest of the Egyptian deities. But in the first plague, the Bible makes it clear that he too is powerless.
You could say that the story of the plagues is a struggle between the gods, because the Pharaoh represents the gods of Egypt, the whole pantheon. And by attacking the Pharaoh, Yahweh is attacking Egypt's gods. So the idea behind the plagues is to show that Yahweh is superior to Egypt, superior to the Pharaoh, and also to the gods he represents.
The miracle of the first plague does not win the Israelites their freedom. Pharaoh, the Bible says, hardens his heart. Then God instructs Moses, "Go unto Pharaoh and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Let my people go, that they may serve me. And if thou refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all thy borders with frogs."
The Pharaoh
that Moses has to deal with is stubborn. He has a boundlessly exaggerated opinion of himself. He's a despot, oppressing people in a totally arbitrary way. That's a malicious misrepresentation, a polemical view of Egypt, because, of course, the Pharaoh had the gods above him, and he was responsible to them. The Bible chooses not to mention that, of course, the Egyptians had their own concept of justice, and the Pharaoh knew perfectly well that the gods were above him.
The Pharaoh of the Bible hardened his heart. After the red tide, the misery of the second plague followed. Frogs left the water in their millions. The size of a frog population experiences natural variations. At the Leibniz Institute in Berlin, scientists are trying to find out what can cause a plague of frogs. What environmental changes lead to abnormal development and mass metamorphosis? The transformation of a tadpole into a frog is governed by hormones. The process usually takes 8 to 10 weeks. The scientists discover that environmental stress causes frog metamorphosis to accelerate. In this experiment, the tadpoles are artificially stressed. They've been fed extra hormones. Their rate of metamorphosis is measured under the microscope. It turns out that negative environmental conditions can nearly double their rate of development. Professor Werner Kloas explains what kind of environmental stimuli are most to blame.
When tadpoles come under stress, especially due to drought, but also when there's a lack of oxygen, then this environmental stress accelerates their transformation into frogs. Their thyroid gland releases extra hormones, and the result can be a sudden massive appearance of frogs.
Frogs overrun the land in their millions, invading the houses of the Egyptians. They even reach Pharaoh's palace, but Pharaoh refuses to let the Israelites go. The broad plains of Cantir hide thousands of years of history. The great city of Pi-Ramses, the historical setting for the biblical city of Ramses. Ramses II, the greatest pharaoh of them all. No other ruler of Egypt won such prestige. Was he also the inspiration for the nameless pharaoh of the Bible? We know he made Pi-Ramses his capital and the symbol of his power. In a plan of the ancient metropolis, the impressive scale of his city is clear to see.
The center of Ramses is an island, surrounded by the branches of the Pelusian arm of the Nile. In the west of the city, there's a sprawling villa district, separated from the Pelusian arm of the Nile by this dark line, an embankment along the river. You can see it's a villa district because the streets are arranged in a rectangular grid containing plots of land with individual houses, with a floor area of up to several thousand square meters. In the east of our city plan is the Workers' District. You can see here that the workers and artisans lived in small houses with very few rooms, just a few square meters.
Ramses II turned Egypt into a building site, creating temples and giant statues on a scale never seen before, monuments forever associated with his name. He needed a cheap and plentiful source of labor. Prisoners of war became slaves for the construction of the city. Others came of their own accord. Egypt's wealth attracted immigrants, many of them fleeing poverty in their own homelands. Could these be the people the Bible means when it says, "And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses"? And yet there are no historical documents that tell of the presence of Israelites in Egypt. All we know for sure about the people who gathered around Moses is that they were nomadic tribes from Palestine. The era of Ramses II was known as the Golden Age in the Chronicles of Egypt. There was no shadow over the period, no biblical disasters to dull its splendor. But within 100 years of Ramses' death, his once mighty city would be a byword for downfall and decay. Pi-Ramses is abandoned. What happened? The disappearance of this mighty metropolis has remained a mystery. The Heidelberg Academy of Sciences and Humanities. Paleoclimatologists Augusto Mangini and Nicole Vollweiler are researching climate changes thousands of years ago. they've discovered remarkable links between climate and the rise and fall of civilizations. Now they're searching for the reason for the mysterious demise of the city of Ramses. This stalagmite is many thousands of years old. Its inner life will give Mangini the data he needs to recreate the historical climatic curve.
9.000, vielleicht 8.000, 7.000, vielleicht.
Stalagmiten zeigen, dass unsere Vorfahren
Stalagmites show that our ancestors were confronted with climate change again and again.
Steine sind ein sehr
In fact,
guter
they can provide a very precise record of variations in temperature and of wet and dry periods in the ancient past.
Phase vergangener Epochen Auskunft gibt.
Stalagmite caves are created when rainwater trickles through from the surface above. Descending through layers of earth and stone, it picks up calcium carbonate that solidifies on the floor of the cave as limestone. Countless evaporated water drops thus build up these columns of stone. Every climatic wet and dry period can be traced in the growth history of the stalagmites. Their age can be calculated through the composition of their isotopes. First, the samples are soaked in acid to separate them into their constituent parts. As they grow, the limestone of the stalagmites absorbs traces of radioactive elements. The concentration of these elements provides the data to calculate their age. They use a mass spectrometer to measure the isotopes and date the stalagmites precisely. It takes 2 long weeks to find out whether these stalagmites can throw light on the fate of P. Ramses. Finally, the scientists turn all this data into a climatic curve. Mangini and Vollweiler correlate the climatic curve to the eras of the Egyptian dynasties. They're sure that each rise and fall of a culture has its counterpart in climatic peaks and troughs. The period of Ramses' reign is highlighted in color. After the peak of a warm, wet climate, there's a climate collapse.
Pharaoh Ramses II.
Pharaoh Ramses II reigned in a very favorable climatic period. There was plenty of rain and his country flourished. However, this wet period only lasted a few decades. After Ramses' reign, the climate curve goes sharply downwards. There's a dry period which would certainly have had serious consequences.
Did climate change bring about the sudden collapse of P. Ramses? For some reason, the inhabitants of the city had to leave. Archaeologists found the first possible clues to the reason 30 kilometers away from Ramses city, at a much older excavation, that of the city of Tanis.
For a long time, we thought Tanis was P. Ramses, because a huge amount of the most wonderful architectural objects were found there. Granite obelisks and quartz statues, all sorts of other things, all bearing the name of Ramses II. They all told the same story of the growing power and splendor of the city, a story we know both from the hymns and from other Egyptian accounts.
Throughout the ruins of Tanis, they found the royal cartouche of Ramses II, the unmistakable symbol of the great pharaoh. But the pedestal and the feet of all the statues were missing. Only one explanation was possible. All these statues had been transferred to Tanis. So this couldn't be the original site of Ramses' city. But why had they all been moved? In the Bible story, the disasters in the land of the Nile get worse. To force the Pharaoh to yield and free the people of Israel from their bondage, the god Yahweh punished the Egyptians with the third and fourth plagues. Swarms of mosquitoes and flies invaded the land. All the dust, the Bible says, turned into insects. Perhaps Ramses' city was devastated by a series of real plagues that found their way as a folk memory into the story in the book of Exodus. When archaeologists realized Tanis couldn't be the city of Ramses, they began to look elsewhere. They only knew Ramses had built his capital on the eastern, Pelusian arm of the Nile.
Here we are at the northern edge of P. Ramses. These are the last traces of the Pelusian arm of the Nile. You have to imagine that this was the main highway for commerce in those days, about 200 meters wide. Now it's a pretty narrow but deep ditch. It's still used for drainage today.
Over the millennia, the River Nile has continuously altered its route. Sand from desert storms and mud from the annual flooding filled up one course, and another opened. In order to identify the location of P. Ramses, first you had to find the ancient eastern arm of the Nile. For years, Manfred Bitak reconstructed all the old courses of the Nile. He discovered what the delta had looked like in the age of the pharaohs by comparing archaeological maps with the contour lines on a topographical map that revealed abrupt changes in the landscape.
You can actually follow the protrusions of the land from one contour line to the next. And from our reconstruction of the Nile's eastern delta, it's very clear where the eastern arm of the Nile lay. And so the focus on where P. Ramses could have been was narrowed down to one place. And that was Cantia.
And in the excavations at Cantia, they found conclusive proof. Thousands of shards of pottery from the time of Ramses, but no pottery from later periods. The only possible conclusion was that the inhabitants abandoned their city 3,000 years ago and turned their back on an entire region.
There would have to be a very good reason to give up a city with a fantastic strategic position like this. The most likely explanation is that the Pelusian arm of the Nile silted up downstream from P. Ramses. And so P. Ramses had to be abandoned.
The climate had changed. A long period of drought and high winds ravaged the landscape of the Nile. We still don't know what causes such natural climate changes and the often dramatic consequences that follow. The climate graph of the ancient world reveals sudden changes over the millennia. For paleoclimatologists, they explain radical changes in those early societies.
Keine Kultur verlässt freiwillig ihren
No
Lebensraum.
culture willingly gives up its homeland, along with its splendid cities, unless there's a pretty dramatic reason.
Wenn wir die Ergebnisse unserer
If we look at the results of our research into the settlement behavior of our ancestors, it quickly becomes clear that climate has always played an extremely important role,
extrem wichtige Rolle
and
spielt,
that long periods of drought have been a reason to move away.
Phasen ein Grund für die Abwanderung waren.
Pi-Ramses turned into a ghost town. Slowly, the Nile, the lifeblood of the city, turned into lakes of still water and silted up. Were algae blooms, fish deaths, and insect swarms the result? Is this the source of the plague stories of the Bible? When a river stops flowing, there are biological consequences. Runoff water overloads it with nutrients. The result is algae growth and oxygen depletion. Hydrologists in Berlin are mimicking this scenario by growing algae in experimental tanks. They pour nitrate and phosphate nutrients into water containing burgundy blood algae. In nature, the water would turn red in 2 to 3 weeks, indicating a massive presence of toxic organisms. The laboratory test shows why burgundy blood algae can destroy a natural water habitat. The measurements show oxygen levels in the water dropping further and further as the algae concentration increases.
These are the biological consequences when flowing water turns into still water. The waters get muddier, the current slows down, and the water temperature rises. The increase in nutrients that follows can lead to the spread of blue algae. And these blue algae can be very toxic. They can unleash a biological chain reaction of the kind described in the first plagues.
The river turned red, fish died, frogs left the water and then perished. Now the insects could multiply unhindered. In a self-regulating ecology, insect numbers on the river are kept in check by the frogs and fish. But without this natural regulator, the numbers of insects reproduce explosively.
You can imagine a chain reaction like this. A massive increase in the number of frogs would be followed by massive frog deaths, so they would no longer be there to eat the insects. Without fish and frogs, the insects would multiply exponentially. We know insects often carry diseases like malaria, so the next step in the chain reaction is the outbreak of epidemics, causing the human population to fall ill.
Epidemien ausbrechen, die natürlich den Menschen also mit Krankheiten heimsuchen.
The authors of the Bible let plague after plague rain down as acts of God. Were these the folk memories of peoples who had experienced similar natural disasters? After the insect plagues, diseases spread among the Egyptians. The flies and mosquitoes departed, but still Pharaoh would not let the Israelites go. And then Yahweh announced the next plagues to Moses. In the trial of strength with Egypt's godlike ruler, plagues 5 and 6 would now strike man and beast without mercy. It happens early in the morning. As the sun rises, God sends a pox upon the Egyptians' livestock. And soon after, as the next sign from God, smallpox breaks out among the people. what the first 6 plagues of the Bible describe could indeed have taken place at the location of ancient P. Ramses.
Mit dem Abnehmen des Wassers im Pelusischen
As the waters sank in the Pelusian arm of the Nile, before they disappeared completely and it silted up, the still waters led to a plague of mosquitoes.
Mückenplagen entwickelten,
Malaria broke out, other plagues and diseases appeared.
Krankheiten kamen.
They affected the population so badly that without a proper supply of fresh water, life in this area, astonishing as it may seem, became impossible.
Kein Leben mehr
And so the people here had to migrate to healthier regions.
Gebiete ausweichen musste.
This gradual process of decay must have deeply affected life in the dying city. We have a copy of an ancient document from this time that shows astonishing parallels to the Bible story of the plagues. The Ipouver papyrus. The Rijksmuseum van Oudheden in Leiden holds this mysterious Egyptian document. The warnings of Ipouver. This puzzling text, 4 meters long, was written hundreds of years before the Old Testament was compiled.
In the Ipouver papyrus, the author just imagines the total chaos of a society where people rebelled against their former masters. So servants had the riches, and those who were rich lost everything. There was a famine. People were hungry. The Nile didn't inundate properly. The gods were angry with the Egyptians. And he contrasts that with the happy life that Egypt could lead under its king when it sticks to the traditions of the ancestors. That's what he wants to say.
Ipouver. We assume this is the name of the wise man who wrote this text. In a poetic style, he describes disasters on a colossal scale. Water turns to blood, society falls into chaos, nature turns against mankind. Hail and darkness fall on the country, animals and humans die. The biblical plagues will later tell almost exactly the same story.
The biblical text was not written down as something independent of everything that happened elsewhere in the Near East. It is part of a literary tradition. Part of that tradition is already 1,000 years or more old. So it's not surprising that we find elements like descriptions of natural disasters that sound familiar. When you know that the text of Ipouver, you find something similar in the Bible.
We don't know exactly when the text was written. The original has never been found.
The copy that we have here in Leiden is the only copy that exists. And it is a copy made by an Egyptian around the period of the famous pharaoh Ramses II.
Why should a copy of a disaster poem be commissioned at the time of the decline of P. Ramses? More than a coincidence? In P. Ramses, the silting up of the river seals the people's fate. Ramses' capital is condemned to destruction. Citizens carry away whole buildings, break off the statues from their pediments. They move everything to Tanis, hoping for a new beginning. The monuments of Tanis are testaments to human willpower, but also to the overwhelming power of nature. P. Ramses was reclaimed by nature. In Cantir, in a cornfield, the find of an unspectacular stone pedestal closes the circle of history.
In a huge effort, almost the whole city of P. Ramses was dismantled, at least the parts made out of stone, and was taken to other locations to build new homes and palaces. The demolition and reconstruction can be seen very clearly via the great statues of Ramses II. Here are the feet in Cantir.
Is this the place the Bible was referring to? Is this the city of Moses, the hero of the struggle against the Pharaoh? The city of the plagues and God-sent miracles. In the story of Moses and the plagues, the Pharaoh has no name. He simply represents the tyrannical power oppressing the people of Israel. By the time the biblical texts are written, Pharaoh Ramses II is a figure of legend.
Ramses ist für die Ägypter.
For the Egyptians, and at the time the Bible was written, Ramses was the personification of a pharaoh. He was virtually synonymous with the title Pharaoh. You didn't even have to say his name. And from the name this city was given, the Old Testament simply calls it Ramses, it was clear that they saw this pharaoh as the pharaoh.
Diesen Pharao als Pharao schlechthin angesehen.
Via the name Ramses, they wanted to evoke the great power of Egypt. He is the symbol of Egypt as superpower.
Ist der Vertreter der Großmacht Ägypten.
Pharaoh Ramses II did not live to see the downfall of his capital. He died of old age at 85. In 1881, his mummy was discovered in an anonymous tomb. When his remains were transported to Cairo, thousands of people lined the shores of the Nile. No one remembered the disasters of ancient times, only the splendor of a golden era. It all began with a red river. Fish die, frogs invade the land. Swarms of mosquitoes and other insects follow. Diseases attack man and beast, and thus we have the first 6 plagues of the Old Testament. The silting up of the river is the end for the city of P. Ramses. Environmental disasters, such as those described in the first plagues, would be an entirely realistic scenario. After the 6th plague, God said to Moses, "Say unto Pharaoh, let my people go, or I will send all my plagues upon thine heart, upon thy servants, and upon thy people." But Pharaoh would not let his heart be softened by the threat. The plagues continued, and the magnitude of the disasters increased. Egypt in the time of the pharaohs, a rich and powerful empire. But the people of Israel live in slavery, oppressed by a tyrannical pharaoh. To win their freedom, Moses sends 10 plagues on Pharaoh's land. As God's fury, they sweep over Egypt. The plagues bring desolation, disease, and death. At least according to the Bible. Are they just legends? Or did these events really happen? The first 6 plagues had struck Egypt. In the Old Testament, one place name indicates a possible location for these events.
Ramses, they call it. They certainly meant P-Ramses.
An ecological disaster destroyed this city. Archaeologists now know the cause. The arm of the Nile that guaranteed its survival dried up.
And for that reason, P-Ramses had to be abandoned.
When the river ran dry, there were serious consequences. It could have triggered an ecological chain reaction.
One explanation for the Nile turning red is the accumulation of burgundy blood algae.
What the first 6 plagues describe, red water, fish deaths, plagues of frogs and insects, and illnesses, could all have occurred in the downfall of P-Ramses. But 500 years before, something far worse happened. The greatest natural disaster the ancient world had ever known, the eruption of Santorini. It caused climate collapse over the whole region. For the peoples of the entire Mediterranean, the world must have descended into chaos. Plagues 7, 8, and 9 tell of hail, locusts, and darkness. Can these be explained scientifically via the eruption of Santorini? In Jerusalem's temple schools, the account of the 10 plagues is being compiled. As the story continues, Moses summons the next plague. And Moses stretched forth his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and the fire ran along upon the ground. Pharaoh was powerless in the face of God's plagues, but the Bible says he hardened his heart, and he would not let the people of Israel go. And with the 7th plague, the hailstones crashed down upon Egypt. But how are massive hailstorms caused? And what could link them with a volcano? At the National Center of Atmospheric Research in Colorado, they're on the track of powerful natural forces. Hailstones from throughout the world have found their way to their deep-frozen archive. Evidence of bad weather on a biblical scale.
This hailstone fell in Coffeyville, Kansas in 1972. And it weighs about 700 grams. And a hailstone this size falls about 40 meters per second. When a hailstorm of this kind occurs, they can kill quite a few people out in the open fields. There was a storm in Bangladesh in 1986 that killed almost 100 people in this way.
The size of a hailstone and its destructive force cannot be predicted. In hailstorms, normality gives way to danger and destructive power. Mere humans are helpless. The events at Coffeyville have been immortalized as the hailstorm of the century.
Keep your eyes shut! Put on your head.
In the Bible, it says that Egypt endured the worst hailstorms in its history. The harvest was destroyed. Man and beast struck down in the fields. The authors of the Bible set these events long before their own time. Could their stories be based on folk memories of natural disasters passed down through the generations?
Wenn man die 10 Plagen der biblischen Exodus,
If you reduce the 10 plagues of the biblical Exodus to their basic elements, you find natural disasters in the form of darkness and hail.
in Form von Finsternis und Hagelsturm, eine insgesamt
This story is fictional when taken as a whole, but it certainly refers to experience, to historical experience.
Der erste Kandidat ist der
The first candidate is the eruption of Thera. This eruption of the volcano of Thera of Santorini must have triggered a global climate disaster.
Eine globale Klimakatastrophe ausgelöst haben.
In the Mediterranean Sea north of Crete is the island group of Santorini, with Thera at its center. About 3,500 years ago, it was the site of the greatest natural disaster of the ancient world. No one could have recognized the warning signs. The last eruption lay 15,000 years in the past.
It must have hit the peoples around the Mediterranean extremely hard. An island and a people well known in the region suddenly and completely disappeared. Nothing was left on Santorini.
The great eruption announced itself slowly at first. As the Black Mountain, the volcano, came to life, foul-smelling sulfurous vapors emerged and spread. The first tremors shook the island. Boiling fountains of steam burst from the sea. Sea quakes caused giant waves to build. These are the heralds of the coming disaster, a few months ahead. A Minoan wall painting from the island. Is this a portrayal of the events before the eruption? It shows a giant wave. On Santorini today, Professor Walter Friedrich and his team are studying the site of the disaster. Together with botanists, physicists, and archaeologists, he has reconstructed its different stages. For the island's inhabitants, it became a race against time. After the first tremors, it's clear they tried to save what they could.
The first sign was that the houses in Akrotiri were destroyed. Walls tumbled down, roofs fell in. The people were terrified. They were afraid something worse was coming. They gathered up food supplies. They even piled their beds up, ready to take them away. And they collected all their valuables. But then there came another sign.
Abandoned food jars, a staircase destroyed by the earthquake. The excavation at Akrotiri shows the houses were almost completely emptied before the eruption. The beds, tied together ready to go, had to be left behind. The population ran out of time. The mountain belched hot volcanic ash. For the Minoan islanders, it was time to leave. Experts believe the population got off the island in time. No traces of valuables or human remains have ever been found. But no one knows where they sailed to take refuge. 700 kilometers southeast of Santorini lies Egypt, the location of the biblical plagues. Is there any trace of the disaster here? At Avaris in the Nile Delta, archaeologist Manfred Bitak has been excavating different ages and layers of Egyptian history for more than 40 years. One of his greatest finds was the discovery of Minoan frescoes in a palace complex of the 18th dynasty, long after the time of the disaster.
Have a look at this. This is a bull jumper. The quality of the painting is fantastic. There's the bull's tail, here's its coat, and here's the bull jumper.
A computer reconstruction shows pictures of another world. They must have been painted by Minoan artists living and working in Avaris generations after their island had been destroyed. The paintings themselves give no hint of the way Minoan civilization must have been shaken to its very foundations.
I think
it was a kind of new beginning. Minoan artists decorating a palace with Minoan paintings. And it's interesting that at the same time the influence of Minoan art on Egyptian art becomes noticeable. That's further evidence that at that time there was close contact between the Minoan world and the Egyptian world.
Zu einem besonderen Kontakt zwischen der minoischen Welt und der ägyptischen Welt gekommen ist.
The excavation's store holds another unusual find from the palace complex. About 140 pumice stones, porous chunks of cooled lava. Are they, perhaps, from the eruption of Santorini? We know that after months of warnings, the island burst open in a series of gigantic explosions.
Das war eine der größten, vielleicht die größte Explosion.
It was one of the biggest, perhaps the biggest explosion ever recorded. It must have been a colossal bang. We can only compare it with Krakatoa in 1883, where the sound of the explosion could be heard in Australia, 5,000 kilometers away. And the shock wave was recorded in Potsdam, in Europe.
Bei Berlin gemessen.
Before collapsing into itself, the volcano expelled 20 billion cubic meters of molten lava. The Atomic Institute in Vienna. Geoscientist and chemist Max Bichler is an international expert in the study of pumice stone. He establishes the origins of unidentified pieces of pumice via the unique chemical fingerprint left by every volcano. We ask him to examine the pumice from Avaris. There are no volcanoes in Egypt, so where does the pumice in Avaris come from? Is it from Santorini? The sample for analysis is prepared from a tiny amount of powdered pumice. The individual chemical makeup of the stone will provide information about its origins. To get it, the stone is bombarded with neutrons in the Institute's reactor. This turns the chemical elements in the pumice into radioactive isotopes. Then, a gamma spectrometer will measure their concentration. This defines the chemical makeup of the stone. Max Bichler analyzes the data on his computer. Based on the resulting profile, the sample can be precisely attributed to one particular volcano. For Bichler, there is no doubt about its source.
This sample of pumice from Avaris can be quite clearly assigned to the Minoan eruption via its chemical fingerprint. And that is true of the majority of pumice samples that we have so far received from this location.
But the pumice found in Avaris doesn't necessarily prove that the Santorini eruption had a catastrophic effect on Egypt. Pumice was a valuable commodity in ancient times. We know pumice from Santorini floated ashore in the Mediterranean. It was gathered up by local people and taken to the towns, where it was adapted for many different purposes in the workshops. It would be ground to a fine powder and then used for sharpening or polishing. Scribes also used the powder to smooth out their papyri. After the Great Eruption, the sea rose up, and giant waves, tsunamis, destroyed entire coastal settlements throughout the Mediterranean region.
There were several tsunamis. There must have been several as a result of the earthquake, and then more in the different phases of the eruption. And probably the greatest tsunami came when the roof of the magma chamber collapsed.
Today we know that tsunamis must have reached a height of 30 meters. The pumice could have been carried far inland by the waves. But it was the ash from the volcano that would have led to climate collapse, lightning and hailstorms. The seventh biblical plague. But how is hail caused? Dust and ashes in the atmosphere cause a temperature drop. But by itself, cold isn't enough. In this experiment, snow crystals are injected into drops of water at -20 degrees. A hailstone is suddenly formed. At the Institute for Atmospheric Physics in Mainz, Nadine von Blom is searching for other elements around which a hailstone can form. Hail needs solid particles in the air, like dust, in order to grow. By adjusting the wind speed and temperature in the atmosphere chamber, Nadine can mimic the conditions of a storm at an altitude of 2,000 meters. Silver iodide particles are injected into the air. A hailstone appears as though out of nowhere. The longer it dances in the currents of the wind tunnel, the bigger it gets. Hailstones occur when rain clouds collide with a mass of icy air. At that moment, the humidity will attach itself to any foreign body. Aerosols, grains of sand, or ash particles are classic binders of hail. Even this giant hailstone from Kansas is the result of a collision with tiny ice and dust particles. Before it impacted on the ground, it passed through many layers of colder and warmer air, growing to a terrifying size. This cross-section under polarized light shows its stages of growth. The eruption of Santorini released millions of tons of ash. Hail could easily have followed. And the Lord thundered in the heavens. He gave his voice, hailstones and fire. He looks on the earth and it trembles. He touches the hills and they smoke. Volcanic eruptions appear again and again in the Old Testament as a metaphor for God's power. Molecular biologist Dr. Ciro Trevisanato was investigating ancient papyri for evidence of the biblical plagues. At first, he was skeptical about a direct connection between the volcano at Santorini and the plagues of Egypt as described in the Bible. Geographically, the two events seemed much too far apart.
The idea that the biblical plagues were related to the Santorini eruption is not new. And I myself didn't really believe in it. In fact, I was wondering, the volcano is roughly 800 kilometers away from the Nile Delta. How is it possible that the volcano can have an effect so far away?
But now, Ciro Trevisanato believes he has found a remarkable connection between the biblical plagues and the Santorini volcano in an ancient Egyptian papyrus, one that even suggests the Santorini eruption could have caused all the plagues. For him, the hailstones are only one consequence of the volcanic eruption. He believes he has found the key in a medical papyrus that describes ancient illnesses and their treatment.
There is a correlation between the Santorini eruption and what is described in the medical papyrus called the London Medical Papyrus. Paragraph 55 describes some burns that were caused by acids. The only source for such a burn would have come from a volcanic source. The best part, though, in this specific paragraph is that we have associated with the burns a red water from the Nile.
In paragraph 55 of the London Medical Papyrus, it says that burns caused by red acidic water should be treated with alkaline mixtures. But the waters of the Nile should on no account be used to prepare this remedy. Could this be a reference to the first plague, when the Nile's waters turned red and were undrinkable?
A volcanic eruption explains all biblical plagues, and it explains them in the order provided by the biblical text.
Acid rain and acidic ash could have contaminated the Nile after the eruption. And according to this theory, it could have set in motion the entire sequence of plagues described in the Bible. In the laboratory, Ciro Trevisanato and his colleagues put his theory to the test. Volcanoes hurl tons of sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, poisonous sulfuric acid compounds that can be carried hundreds of kilometers by the wind. Trevisanato uses the volcanic sulfates to make a series of different solutions. Their acidity levels are tested using litmus paper and recorded. Next, they need to find out how acid rain caused by volcanic eruptions can damage organic material. Plants are sprayed with sulfate solutions. The earth around them is contaminated too. They don't hold out for long. After just 6 hours, the effects of the poison are visible.
Ash fallout is able to explain the plagues because the fallout would first of all have colored and acidified the Nile, killing the fish. Moreover, it would have pushed the frogs out of the Nile. Now, the flesh would have attracted insects. Moreover, the persistence of the ash that didn't fall out would have caused weather anomalies by poisoning, for example, the grass. All herbivores died. And then we have the boils. Then we get another weather anomaly, i.e. the hail. And then we get the locusts.
In the Bible, the Egyptians are helpless against the plagues. But did the historical Egyptians actually have advanced medical knowledge to cope with the effects of the eruption? In the same papyrus, there are detailed instructions for making medicines. In 6 medical texts, there's advice on how to treat corrosive wounds to the skin and eyes caused by acidic substances. And there's even a formula for a cream to treat burns caused by red water. Clay, oil, ochre, resin, beef fat and wax must be finely ground and mixed together. That's paragraph 55 of the London Medical Papyrus. Then the doctor, also the chief magician, must appeal to the gods with magic words to help in the work of healing. In the Bible story, the Pharaoh's most senior magicians were powerless in the face of the plagues. And yet the Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go. And the God Yahweh sent the next plague. And Moses stretched forth his rod over the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought an east wind upon the land all that day and all that night. And when it was morning, the east wind brought the locusts. They fell upon the land in their millions, and devoured all that was left behind by the hailstones. They destroyed the crops in the fields and stripped the trees of fruits and leaves.
Many consider the locusts to be the plague par excellence. And yes, we can explain it in light of the ash fallout. Why? Because the ash fallout had caused weather anomalies, which translates into higher precipitations, higher humidity, and that's exactly what fosters the presence of the locusts.
Every day, locusts consume their own weight in vegetation. They're found on every continent. Scientists at the University of Halle in Germany are researching how and why swarms of locusts develop. They breed their own locusts at the institute to find out. Hans-Jörg Ferentz's team have discovered something crucial. The creation of a swarm and the direction it takes depend above all on the weather. Locusts like to aim for wet and rainy regions.
The locusts simply make use of the fact that wind usually moves from a high-pressure area to a low-pressure area. And low pressure almost always means an area where it's raining or where it has rained. So it makes a lot of sense to move with these currents of air because you get to a place where you can lay eggs and where your offspring will probably have favorable conditions to develop. Because it has rained and plants will grow, which can then be eaten.
As they search for food, locusts migrate between the weather fronts. A swarm on the move can cover up to 40 kilometers a day. In the labs, the scientists are keen to find out how locusts can reproduce so successfully.
Locusts are real breeding machines when conditions are favorable. When they get enough to eat and when the environmental conditions are right, they can produce enormous numbers of offspring in a very short time.
Before laying its eggs, the female locust fills the egg hole with a special foamy secretion to stop it drying out. This way, the eggs can survive a long time, even in dry, powdery or sandy ground. The 70 eggs she's laid are simply waiting for the next rainfall. Then the baby locusts emerge in their masses. A locust swarm contains up to 2 billion insects. If a swarm like this descends on a farmer's fields, it will strip them bare, consuming up to 40,000 tons of vegetation in a day. The Bible says the plague of locusts destroyed all the crops of the land of the Nile, until the west wind blew them away. But then the series of disasters continued. With the 9th plague, an all-encompassing darkness covered Egypt. In the middle of the day, it became as dark as the darkest night. A terrifying phenomenon that has made humans in all eras fearful of the end of the world. A total eclipse of the sun caused terror in the ancient world. But it can be ruled out as a historical explanation of the 9th plague. In an eclipse, the phase of absolute darkness lasts only a few minutes. The Bible describes a darkness that settled on the land for 3 days. Sandstorms that extinguish all daylight can lead to long periods of darkness over wide areas. In China, they're known as yellow dragons. Year after year, they transform Beijing into an impenetrable chaos. But volcanoes are the cause of the blackest darkness. And the biblical darkness could find its explanation in the ash fallout from the Santorini eruption. The evidence to link the Santorini disaster with the Bible plagues is very tempting. The search for more answers about the effect of Santorini on Egypt takes us to Charu and the dig led by archaeologist Abdel Maqsoud. For years now, he's been researching the eastern frontier posts of the ancient Egyptian empire. As he uncovered the foundations of fortifications, he discovered unexpected signs of a great volcanic eruption in the Bronze Age.
When I started excavation here, I cannot expect that I will find something. Put the site of Charu in direct contact with the volcano of Santorini.
But then he found pumice stones, just like in nearby Avaris. Unlike the scientists there, Maqsoud believes that the effects of the eruption hit Egypt unexpectedly hard.
When we discovered lava of this volcano here, and they discovered in Avaris, we understand that Egypt affected from the volcano of Santorini. The water of the Mediterranean arrives through the Pelusiac branch, which it passes here in this area, and through the Pelusiac branch until Avaris. The waves of the sea, about 20 meters, it was very high, and the only part very low, this area, and the branch of the Nile, we will understand that the effect covered a very big area and very archaeological site.
When the volcano collapsed in on itself, the mass of displaced water built up into tsunamis. traveling at speeds of hundreds of kilometers an hour. By racing up the arms of the Nile, they would have caused untold damage. The eruption of Santorini has been dated to somewhere between 1550 and 1500 BC. But where are the records of the event in the Egyptian chronicles? In Egyptian records, these are boom times. From the mid-16th century BC, the boundaries of the Egyptian empire are extended as never before. In a series of military campaigns, the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty conquered all of Asia Minor. In the Temple of Karnak, the triumphs of the victorious pharaohs are carved in stone. With pictures of the crushing of their enemies, the pharaohs celebrate their own glory and their power. There is no sign of any effects of the Santorini eruption in the illustrations of this period. The caldera of Santorini today. For years now, doubts have been growing among scientists about the exact date of the eruption. The critical evidence is buried here under layers of lava. Geologists have discovered an olive branch covered by lava 3,000 years ago. This branch, preserved in volcanic rock, is a sensational find. This is organic material, so it can be carbon dated. The moment the olive branch died will be the exact date of the volcanic eruption. After dating a previous find, Walter Friedrich is convinced that the once accepted date for the eruption will have to be pushed back 100 years. If that result is confirmed with this branch, the new timing will be unchallengeable. This lava wall shows what must have happened in the eruption. The brown earth is the original level of the landscape. This is where the olive trees stood that perished in the inferno, before the storm of hot ash stripped the leaves off the trees, and before the lava flows that followed buried them under 60 meters of pumice.
There was a root here at this spot. I say was because the root is no longer there. We only have the dust of the root, but we have the holes. And then we see that this white layer starts quite abruptly. It's about 4 centimeters thick here, quite clear. That's volcanic dust, pumice dust. And here at this point, we see olive leaves in this layer. And here and there, we find the remains of twigs and olive stones. And so we are quite sure that there were olive trees growing here.
To put it, yes.
The first olive branch that was measured split the scientific world. Some experts doubted the new dating of 1613 BC. It was based on just one sample, with no chance to make a comparative test. The new find is taken from a different tree. Will this branch confirm the new dating?
Yes.
A sheet of tinfoil protects the wood as it's sawn through to gather test samples. None of the valuable material must be lost. At Germany's Hohenheim University, they keep samples from trees thousands of years old. This wooden archive contains unlimited data from past ages, stored in the memory of the trees. Paleobotanist Michael Friedrich is an expert in dendrochronological dating. He will prepare the sample from Santorini for carbon-14 testing. The surface is made smooth and marked for microscopic analysis to enable the identification and counting of the annual rings. Michael Friedrich must look for places where the outside ring just beneath the bark is still present. Only then will a precise dating be possible. And there it is. At carefully measured intervals between the outside ring and the center of the tree, he prepares the samples for carbon-14 analysis. The prepared samples arrive at Heidelberg University's Institute for Radiometric Age Assessment. Now the final preparations for carbon dating can go ahead. The wood is broken into smaller sections and cleaned. Then it's enclosed in an airtight quartz file. All organic elements are now burnt off to reduce the test sample to pure carbon. The first Santorini olive branch was dated by radiation physicist Bernd Kromer. This is his chance to carry out a comparative test on the second branch.
Via radiocarbon dating, we can identify the time when the tree was alive, because it absorbed carbon out of the atmosphere. The tree could have died a long time before the eruption and remained standing in the landscape as a dead tree. In that case, carbon-14 testing would still establish the date of the tree's death, but not the date of the eruption. But we can rule out that situation because beneath the tree we found leaves, and that shows that the tree was alive at the time of the eruption.
The measurement of the radioactive carbon-14 content takes place in the mass spectrometer. The result is 95% accurate. This complex procedure takes 3 weeks. Finally, the age of the branch is indicated on this calibrated graph.
We measured 2 separate samples of the second olive branch, as we did of the first, and these measurements confirm that the volcanic eruption took place in the 17th century BC and not the 16th century.
The 2 finds from Santorini tally perfectly. They confirm a new date for the eruption. Santorini exploded sometime between 1620 and 1600 BC. 3,630 years ago, the olive branch was covered by lava. The now confirmed date of its death will have huge consequences for future research and for our understanding of ancient history. Armed with the new date, we can return to the excavation at Charu in the Egyptian Sinai to see whether historical events did leave their mark in the wake of this great disaster. to see how it could have affected the social and political climate of the times. The remains of these fortifications tell of Egypt's darkest period. They were used by the Hyksos, foreign rulers from Asia Minor, who seized power in Egypt's northern empire. The empire of the pharaohs was split in two. For the first time, part of Egypt was under foreign control. The years that followed were times of economic decline and serious unrest. The era of the Hyksos kings long remained a trauma in the Egyptian imagination. Did the after effects of this great natural volcanic catastrophe lead to a time of struggle and chaos? And did it also trigger the plagues the Bible tells us about? The fury of the gods was the only possible explanation in those days for this terrifying rampage of natural forces. The first 9 plagues tell us about contaminated rivers, fish deaths, plagues of frogs and vicious insects, about epidemics of disease, hailstorms and plagues of locusts, followed by a deep darkness. Were the Hebrew scholars recording folk memories passed down through the generations? Everywhere in history, encounters with inexplicable events have a profound cultural impact. Disasters and their consequences remain alive, immortalized in stories and fables.
The God of the Hebrew Bible had to be able to control natural forces, or he would have been of no interest to the believers. Only a God who can cause earthquakes and epidemics and starvation and droughts is also a God who can protect his people from such phenomena. That is a basic thought that lasted far into the Christian period, that it was far worse for pre-modern man to have no God at all than to have a God who was sometimes evil, cruel, angry, or unpleasant.
In the biblical duel between Moses and the Pharaoh, the plague of darkness is a mortal challenge to the greatest of the Egyptian deities. The sun god Ra, who guarantees the rhythm of day and night and the continuation of life, is proved powerless. But even after the 9th plague, Pharaoh does not let the Israelites go. And the Lord said unto Moses, Yet I will bring 1 plague more upon the Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterwards he will let you go hence. With the 10th plague, all the firstborn of the land of Egypt will die. Egypt, in the time of the pharaohs, a rich and powerful empire. But the people of Israel live in slavery, oppressed by a tyrannical pharaoh. To win their freedom, Moses sends 10 plagues on Pharaoh's land. As God's fury, they sweep over Egypt. The plagues bring desolation, disease, and death. At least according to the Bible. Are they just legends? Or did these events really happen? The evidence led to the city of Ramses. The downfall of this great city came in a period of drought. Nature was out of balance. The river that guaranteed the survival of the city dried up. Red waters, frogs, insects and diseases, all the phenomena of the first 6 plagues could have followed. The eruption of Santorini helped scientists decipher the 7th, 8th and 9th plagues. The colossal amounts of volcanic ash led to climate collapse and terrible storms. Hail, darkness and a plague of locusts are realistic scenarios. The death of the firstborn is the 10th and most mysterious of the plagues. It leads to the exodus of the Israelites into the Promised Land. The archaeological fragments build into a complicated puzzle. Recent excavations have begun to unravel the mystery of the legendary Hyksos. Were they the historical people of the Bible? There is no proof the Israelites were ever in Egypt. Yet the name of Israel and the name of the biblical God appear for the first time in Egypt. Archaeologists are sifting through information from across the centuries to find the key to the story of the Bible plagues and of the Exodus. In the Old Testament, the account of the 10th plague is more detailed than all the others. It tells of the God Yahweh's final blow, the one that would free the Israelites from bondage in Egypt. God transmits his plan to Moses in precise detail. Every Israelite must borrow gold and silver jewelry from his Egyptian neighbors. God will make them agree. And then the Israelites must prepare the first Pesach ceremony. Moses is to go to Pharaoh one last time and announce the terrible 10th plague that is to come that very night. And Moses said, "Thus saith the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt. And all the firstborn of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh even unto the firstborn of the maidservant, and all the firstborn of beasts." Towards evening, the Israelites mark their doors with the blood of the sacrificed Pesach lamb, the sign for God to spare them the horrors to come. It happens that night. The destroyer, the angel of death, passes through the land of Egypt.
The last plague is very different from the others. It isn't linked to natural phenomena. You could say it's a theological plague. It seems very cruel to us because Yahweh will massacre all the firstborn of Egypt. What does that mean? It means the total extermination of Egypt. Because in the ancient Middle East, the firstborn symbolized the future of a people. Losing the firstborn is losing the future.
Behind their bolted doors, the Israelites share the Pesach meal according to the instructions they've been given. The lamb must be roasted on the fire and eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. The Israelites are to sit at their table dressed for departure, and anything that isn't eaten must be burned. As promised, the God Yahweh does not harm his chosen people. Death passes over their houses. In the Jewish faith, this covenant for God's protection finds its ritual expression in the Passover ceremony. The second book of Moses says, "And it shall come to pass, when your children shall say unto you, What mean you by this service? Ye shall say, It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses." Silently, God's punishment is carried out. While the Israelites wait in their houses, death strikes down all the Egyptian firstborn, man and beast alike. There was not a house where there was not one dead. The great killing of the firstborn strikes every family without exception and without respect for rank. Even the firstborn son of the Pharaoh must die. With the 10th plague, the series of biblical disasters reaches its mysterious zenith and leaves behind a puzzle. The first 9 plagues the Hebrew scholars describe are comprehensible natural phenomena. Poisoned rivers, frogs and insects, disease, hail and darkness. All these could actually have happened in Egypt. But the 10th plague, dealing with the unimaginable, the death of the firstborn, remains an enigma. Attempts to explain it scientifically have looked at the possibility of an illness or an infectious disease. Poisoned wheat is one explanation. The Egyptians had stores of food, and when the harvest was poor, this was the only way to feed the people. But after the previous plagues of hail and locusts, supplies of grain could have been contaminated by humidity and the excreta of the insects. A lethal fungal mold could have been the result. Trichotocene, the poison of the Fusarium fungus, can kill both humans and animals. The male firstborn would have had first pickings of the limited food reserves and would have been the first to fall victim to the poison. Psalm 78 of the Old Testament has another explanation for the 10th plague. He spared not their soul from death, but gave their life over to the pestilence, and smote all the firstborn in Egypt. Real plagues claimed hundreds of thousands of lives in the Middle East in ancient times, but that wouldn't explain why only the male firstborn died. Like the Pesach offering and God's sparing of the Israelites, this is religious symbolism.
The 10th plague has the longest description because it is combined with a blood ritual, which was almost certainly a ritual of protection. It originated with the nomads and with the shepherds who used the blood to protect themselves against the desert demons who attacked their flocks or attacked the shepherds themselves. The Bible's authors are taking an ancient ritual and connecting it to the events of the Exodus.
The ritual of blood and the Pesach meal, which the Bible links inextricably with the 10th plague and the exodus of the Israelites, actually go back to an archaic festival in the ancient agrarian culture of the land of Canaan. Blood as protection, blood as a blessing. In the human struggle to survive in the rhythm of the seasons, it was the young men's job to move out of the settlements with the herds every year in springtime. This was the only way to protect the young stalks of corn in the fields from being eaten by the livestock. Before the young men left the community, there was a ceremony with a ritual of blood and a sacrificial meal for protection. In the Pesach of the Bible, the blood on the doors symbolizes this magical protection. In union with the one God, this mark becomes a sign that will ward off all dangers.
Dieser Blutritus beim Auszug der Hirten und Hirtinnen.
This blood rite, linked to the departure of the shepherds and shepherdesses, also helps protect the parents and children who have been left behind.
Jahreszeitliche, bäuerliche Ritus wird
Via the story of the night when Yahweh smote the firstborn of Egypt, this seasonal agricultural ritual became a part of the collective memory of the Israelites.
zum Element des kollektiven Gedächtnisses Israels.
The 10th plague in the Bible story has a single purpose. It demonstrates the superiority of God over a godlike Pharaoh and shows his power to lead his people from slavery to freedom. In the religious legend, the Exodus symbolizes the birth of the people of Israel. 600,000 men and untold numbers of women and children, the Bible tells us, follow Moses into the Holy Land. Archaeologists have found no trace of a human migration on this scale. And outside the Bible, there is no reference to a people enslaved in Egypt. Is there any historical evidence of the biblical Israelites and their story? In the 1st century AD, the Jewish historian Josephus Flavius quotes a source that recounts the biblical Exodus from an Egyptian perspective. The passages he quotes by the Egyptian priest Manetho offer tantalizing hints about the identity of the people of the Bible. Manetho gives a grim account of Egypt's darkest times. Under the rule of the legendary Hyksos, mysterious foreigners he identifies with the people of the Bible. They are said to have founded the city of Jerusalem after being expelled from Egypt. Manetho is said to have written, "People of an unknown race suddenly attacked Egypt from the east. They conquered the land easily without a battle. And once they had taken control, they burned the cities to the ground and destroyed the temples of the gods. They treated the people monstrously, massacring many of them and dragging the women and children into slavery. Finally, one of their number, named Salatis, became king. This account does not describe the people of the Bible as slaves. It tells of victorious lords and conquerors. Salatis was the first king of the Hyksos. Who were they? Are they the historical key to the Bible story? At the excavations of Tel el-Daba, archaeologist Manfred Bitak has been studying the Hyksos for many years. Here in the Nile Delta is the site of the city of Avaris, where the story of the Hyksos began in the 17th century BC. Very little is known of them, and there are few foundations and archaeological remains in these layers of earth to tell us about their times. With this single exception, this excavation of a great palace and administrative complex is of huge archaeological importance. It promises to reveal more about these mysterious foreigners who made themselves kings in Egypt and made Avaris the center of their power, their metropolis. Avaris had existed for centuries here in northern Egypt, where several trade routes come together. Immigrants from Canaan and the whole of Asia Minor made this city an expanding center of trade. By the 17th century BC, Avaris is home to merchants, artisans, and farmers. Among them, the people who would soon call themselves Hyksos. Manetho would later identify them as the people of the Bible. Soon they controlled the economy of the Nile Delta and filled the top positions in the administration. A success story that seems to conflict with the fate of the people of the Bible. To the Egyptians, the Hyksos, like all the peoples from the north, were quite simply Asiatics. But as successful merchants, shipbuilders, and warriors, they formed an elite group that brought advanced technology to Egypt. They introduced horse-drawn chariots and other unknown weaponry to the country.
The
Hyksos is the name of a foreign dynasty in Egypt, and not the name of a people. But we know they came from Asia Minor. And when the Egyptian kingdom fell apart in the 18th century BC, that is, during the 13th dynasty, it was easy for them to set up a vassal system. They took over the status of pharaohs quite officially.
The remains of a funerary statue found in Avaris can tell us what these Asiatics may have looked like. Notice especially the mushroom-shaped hairstyle and the colorful striped coat. The man's skin seems yellowish in color. The wooden scepter in his hand marks him out as an official. The search for these foreigners leads to the burial chambers of Beni Hassan, some distance from Avaris in Middle Egypt. These immigrants from the Near East are depicted on the walls, as the Egyptians saw them. They can be recognized by their sharp profiles, their beards, and their hairstyles, and by the yellow hue of their skin and the colorful patterns of their clothes. They're clearly different from the Egyptians also depicted here. Unlike the high officials at Avaris, these people belong to the ordinary population. Thus, the statue in Avaris is evidence of a remarkable social ascent for this immigrant people.
In my view, what we see here is a city aristocrat, a holder of very high office who portrays himself in a costume from Asia Minor. Just like the rest of the Asiatic population, he has not assimilated Egyptian style, but he has kept his identity. This suggests that the Asiatics in Egypt were extremely self-confident. But it's interesting that the Egyptians used the same word for Asiatics, Amu, as they used for slaves.
These slaves became rulers. Their rise to power took place over centuries, until the Hyksos turned the old hierarchy on its head. We don't know exactly what happened in Avaris around 1650 BC, but it seems likely that this group of immigrants from Asia Minor took over power. They made one of their number king and claimed the status of pharaohs. This inscription engraved on a doorpost records the name of the new rulers, Hyksos, which means rulers of foreign lands. It's written in hieroglyphics so that every Egyptian can read it.
This was something unbelievable. For the first time, foreigners ruled in Egypt. These Asiatics had been known for a long time. They had settled in Avaris in the eastern Nile Delta. When the central power weakened, they took their chance to grab power here. The empire was split into two parts, one in the eastern Nile Delta and the other in Thebes, today's Luxor.
The Hyksos could extend their power in the Nile Delta without opposition. The wealthy trading center of Avaris became their capital. The palace complex that Manfred Bitak has been excavating since 2006 may have been their headquarters. These seem to be the foundations of a huge administrative wing. A geophysical projection shows the impressive scale of the Hyksos city.
Towards the end of the time of the Hyksos, Avaris reached a size of 250 hectares, and we estimate that 25 to 30,000 people lived in this city. That is a huge city for those times, perhaps one of the greatest in the entire eastern Mediterranean.
The foreigners confidently continued to practice their own culture. Their rites and traditions spread. In Avaris, the nature god Baal merged with the Egyptian god Seth to form a new cult, the cult of Seth Baal. A new god is born, and under the Hyksos king Apophis, this god becomes the central deity. The worship of a single god was a concept entirely foreign to Egypt.
One can
tentatively say that this was a first step to monotheistic thinking in the broadest sense. The expulsion of the Hyksos would then be connected to the idea that the Egyptians did not want to be forced to worship one single god.
Long after the Hyksos were banished, the Egyptian ruler Hatshepsut proclaimed, "I have restored what was destroyed when the Asiatics were in Avaris, and scoundrels among them overturned what was created, for they ruled without the god Re." When the pharaohs reconquered Avaris in the middle of the 16th century BC, they destroyed all traces of the Hyksos. The time of foreign rule was to be forgotten. But by suppressing the memory of the Hyksos, the Egyptians created a puzzle. Today, scientists face the challenge of reconstructing the truth about this legendary people from the smallest archaeological fragments. Are there, as Manetho claimed, parallels between the Hyksos and the people of the Bible? Or is his account an early example of spin and myth-making? Tiny traces of seals provide an answer here, not the vast remains of temples and statues. In the ruins of Avaris, Manfred Bitak has found several seals with human and animal motifs, and 6 seals with names. One is a biblical name, Jacob.
Memories of the time of the Hyksos may well live on in the Old Testament, through Abraham, Sarah, and above all Jacob and Isaac. One of the Hyksos kings is called Jacob, and several have Jacob as part of their names. These names are from Semitic languages, and they're later found in the Old Testament.
Does the discovery of the biblical name Jacob on a seal from the time of the Hyksos mean they could have been the people of the Bible? The archaeologists have found a pit that may hold some answers. More and more clay vessels, animal bones, shards and ashes are coming to light here. In the middle of the palace complex, in a courtyard 2 meters beneath the foundations. The scientists believe these are the remains of a sacrificial meal, perhaps part of a ritual of departure and farewell. The Bible describes Pesach as a sacrificial meal, after which all the leftovers had to be burned before the Israelites departed from Egypt. The sacrificial pit at Avaris suggests a comparable cultural ritual in which the inhabitants destroyed the remains of their meal, together with their pottery plates and vessels. From their analysis of the pottery shards, archaeologists have concluded that the palace was then abandoned. We don't know what could have caused the people in the palace to take this step. Were the Hyksos in danger in their own capital? They only ruled another 50 years in Avaris before they were expelled by force. Mid-16th century BC. For decades, the Egyptian pharaohs have tried and failed to regain power from the Hyksos and rule over all Egypt once more. Now Pharaoh Ahmose I retakes the city of Avaris and puts an end to a century of foreign domination. But the expulsion of the Hyksos remains a mystery too. In Avaris, there are no traces of a battle. Yet 30 kilometers away, archaeologists at the excavation site of Charu are working on a reconstruction of events. They found remains of the original fortifications. This was the crucial defensive outpost of the Hyksos in the Sinai Desert.
During the time of Ahmose, the military action was taken against Charu before Avaris, because Charu here has a military position to protect Avaris. The Egyptian was intelligent enough to think before attacking Avaris, to cut between Avaris and the east, to siege Avaris from the east, because this is the only entrance for Avaris. And I think that the battle against the Hyksos was here.
The fall of the fortress at Charu is a decisive victory for Pharaoh Ahmose I. It will lead to the expulsion of the Hyksos, and there is an eyewitness to his triumph. This unique account of the conquest of Avaris can be found at El Kap in Middle Egypt, in an excavated cave some way apart from the main dig. It's a report by a soldier, Ahmose Ebana, who fought with Pharaoh Ahmose I in Avaris. The inscriptions in his tomb tell of his wartime adventures. How he followed the pharaoh's chariot and fought at his side at Avaris against the Hyksos, and then plundered the conquered city. I was with the king when the city of Avaris was besieged, and I took my booty from there, 1 man and 3 women, in total 4 people. His Majesty gave them to me as slaves. Pharaoh Ahmose I and his army drove the Hyksos out of Avaris and pursued them to their fortress at Sharuhen in southern Canaan. We besieged Sharuhen for 3 years. Then His Majesty took the fortress. I received gold for my bravery.
The rule of the Hyksos was traumatic for the Egyptians and remained so for a long time afterwards. For the Hyksos, Asiatics, miserable sand dwellers were considered culturally inferior by the Egyptians. Actually, they weren't seen as really human at all. This rabble had come to Egypt and wrested power from the pharaohs, from the sons of the sun. That simply wasn't possible. By defending itself against the Hyksos, Egypt became an imperial power. It invaded and occupied Canaan and made it a colony.
The Egyptian priest Manetho wrote of a people who departed from Egypt and then were said to have founded the city of Jerusalem in Canaan. This led some to look for traces of a Canaanite people in Egypt and to turn their attention to the Hyksos and their period of power. Their names, their rituals, and their expulsion from Egypt are the main parallels with the Bible story of the Exodus. Did the history of the Hyksos influence the story of the Israelites in the Bible? Did the religious legend then give a new meaning to their expulsion? One in which the Exodus was no longer a defeat by the Pharaoh, but a victory over him. Yet the Hyksos were a ruling dynasty, not truly a people, and the existence of the Israelites at that time has not been historically proved. Manetho's account is just the first piece of this great historical puzzle.
The story of the Hyksos may have influenced the memory of the writers of the account of the Exodus. The Hyksos were indeed kings from Asia Minor, so they were very probably Semitic like the later Israelites. And we know that the Hyksos left a lasting memory because the Greeks are still referring to them in the 3rd century BC, so it's perfectly possible that the people who wrote the story of the Exodus were thinking of the Hyksos. But they turned the situation round because the Hyksos were kings who were expelled, while the Bible story tells of slaves who were expelled or who were chased away by the Pharaoh.
The Bible texts were written 1,000 years after the time of the Hyksos. Was another people enslaved in Egypt during this time, in the way the Hebrew scholars describe? After the Hyksos leave, a new era begins for the Egyptians. The pharaohs take control of Asia Minor. Canaan becomes an Egyptian province. More and more prisoners of war from Canaan are taken to Egypt as slaves. Among them, a group the Egyptians call the Apiru, and whom they describe as crooks and bandits. They appear in Egyptian sources as mercenaries and slaves. A papyrus from the time of Ramses reports that they dragged the stones for the construction of the Great Pylon. Some scholars believe that these were among the first Israelites. The name Apiru later became Hebrew.
When you start looking for the origins of the Hebrews, you soon come across an Egyptian term, Apiru, which can be linked to the term Hebrew. For the Egyptians, Apirus were on the edge of society, whether in Egypt or in Canaan. Sometimes they worked as serfs for the pharaoh, and sometimes they fought against him. It's perfectly possible that the word Hebrew comes from this term.
At the end of the 13th century BC, the name of Israel appears for the very first time on the victory stele of the pharaoh Meremptah, in a list of the peoples conquered in the campaign in Canaan. Israel is devastated and has no more seeds, the inscription says. The exact words leave no doubt. They refer to a people, not a country. Pharaoh Meremptah had advanced into the wild, mountainous regions of Canaan. Here he encountered not soldiers, but simple farmers, settled nomads who had begun to join with other small communities since the 13th century BC. They scraped together a living growing corn and looking after animals. They were the beginnings of a new, independent society, which would become the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Today, scholars know how the early Israelites lived. This reconstruction shows the typical four-roomed house that became a new architectural standard at the beginning of the Iron Age in the mountains of Canaan. Two parallel storerooms or stalls were located at right angles to the living area for people. Archaeologists found four-room houses like this that demonstrate the spread of a new social way of living in the whole mountainous region. The architecture of these houses helps us in the search for evidence of the early Israelites in Egypt. It takes us to the temple district of Medinet Habu in Luxor. Generations of pharaohs built their funerary temples here. In the 1930s, archaeologists excavating the temple area of Ramses III found traces of the people who built the temples. Prisoners of war brought to Egypt as slave workers. They found the remains of their dwellings next to the ruins of the temple. The ground plans and the unusual method of construction were not Egyptian. Manfred Bitak went back to his predecessor's records. In the ground plan of the building workers' houses, he recognized typical elements of the Canaanite four-roomed house. And from that, he could draw conclusions about the origins of the people who had built them.
Ramses III had launched a military campaign in the Seir Desert.
We believe that his prisoners of war were sent to work on the different temples of the empire. In this case, their job was to tear down the temples of Aia and Haremhab in order to build a temple for Ramses IV. That would have been in the 12th century BC. That was exactly the time in which the four-roomed houses were being built in Canaan and Palestine. And it's no coincidence that this type of house appears in Egypt at the same time.
The discovery of these houses in Medinet Habu is an indication that people from Canaan were in Egypt as slaves. Among the list of names of defeated peoples on the temple walls, there's an inconspicuous inscription that refers to the people of the Bible. Engraved in stone is the name Yahu, which will one day become Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament. The people who worshipped Yahweh were nomads. They called themselves the Shasu Bedouins of Yahu. Illustrations of their capture by the forces of Pharaoh Meremptah in the Temple of Karnak offer a picture of the Shasu, the people who would one day unite with the growing community of Israel.
Der Name Yahu steht, wie wir heute sagen können.
Today we can say the name of Yahu stands for this nomadic grouping,
Genauso wie für das Reservat,
as well as for the region where they may have settled,
sein konnten zeitweise,
and for the God they worshipped.
den Gott, den sie verehrt haben.
Yahu was the name of their God. And this form, Yahu, is also the basis for the name of God in the Bible.
These groups of early nomads have left traces in the Sinai Desert. Puzzling signs in early Hebrew letters are carved in a wall in a mine near Serabit. Nearby, a relief shows prisoners or slaves being flogged by an Egyptian overseer. Are these references to the people who found their way into the Bible stories? In the copper mines of Timna, foreign workers like the Shasu mined ore for smelting in the pharaoh's workshops. An inscription here provides further clues to the origins of the Bible story. It names a leader who experts believe could even be the historical model for Moses. This man's Egyptian name is Ramses Empere. He's from Asia Minor and has the rank of a court official. As an inspector at the copper mines, it's his job to mediate between the mine workers, the Shasu, and the pharaoh's administration.
Ramses Empere hat in seinem
The name Ramses Empere reminds us a little of Moses.
Das ist ein
He was a diplomat who served under a number of pharaohs, from Ramses II to Ramses III.
Zweiten bis Ramses III. Offenbar gedient hat.
His services could be used in contacts with the Palestinian peoples.
Zu dem palästinensischen Raum zu schaffen.
In the Bible story, Moses will lead his people to freedom. The earliest texts of the story of Moses and the Exodus are from the 7th century BC, a time of new beginnings under a young king. The disparate groups of the early Israelites have long since become a nation, living in the two separate empires of Israel and Judah. King Josiah of Judah dreams of an empire that will unite all Israelites. Jerusalem will be its capital, and it will serve only one God, Yahweh. There are still plenty of gods in this land. Yahweh is not without competition at the time the Bible is written. Archaeological finds show that until Josiah's reign, Yahweh even had a woman at his side, Asherah, the great goddess of fertility. There are many nature goddesses who are worshipped in religious rituals, but Asherah's cult is widespread. In the Temple of Jerusalem, her statue is on equal footing with that of Yahweh. King Josiah's reforms will break with a 1,000-years-old tradition, mankind's belief in a multiplicity of gods.
Ganz gewiss haben die Reformmaßnahmen des
King Josiah's reforms certainly led to a situation where monotheism slowly imposed itself.
allmählich verfestigen konnte. Und das dann in dieser Zeit
And the worship of Asherah as a companion god, sitting at the right hand of Yahweh, as it were, could no longer be sustained.
nicht mehr aufrechterhalten wurde.
In a radical religious reform, Josiah elevates the cult of Yahweh to the state religion. The Temple of Jerusalem is the only place where Yahweh may be prayed to. Other religious cults are ruthlessly suppressed. Altars and cult sites are torn down, statues and graven images destroyed. And Yahweh's empire must be extended. The situation in the 7th century BC seems to favor expansion. Assyria's domination is breaking down. The small Jewish kingdom sees its chance to gain more land and greater freedom. But the dream of this ambitious king comes to a sudden end in the year 609 BC. Josiah has reckoned without Egypt. The old great power will be the doom of the young pretender. In Megiddo, a strange event takes place that puts the emerging biblical story in a new light. Pharaoh Necho II marches north with his troops. Josiah rides out with a small delegation to meet the Egyptian ruler. We still don't know what he hoped to achieve.
Man fragt sich, warum hat dieser törichte Joschia, warum?
It looks rather stupid of Josiah. Why did he set himself up against Necho? But it may have made perfect sense to Josiah, the monotheist, the unquestioning servant of his Lord, who stands up to the arrogant Pharaoh and fights for freedom.
Und für die Freiheit streitet.
We don't know if Josiah wanted to assert national and religious independence by fighting the Pharaoh, or if he simply wanted to negotiate. But we're told that Necho II killed him in front of his followers.
For the Jewish scribes, even then writing the Old Testament, Josiah's death must have come as a terrible shock. The king in whom they had put their trust had been killed by the Pharaoh. If you read the story of the plagues against that background, you can't help wondering if the duel between Moses and the Pharaoh takes up this story, but in reverse. That's to say, now it's the representative of Yahweh who defeats the Pharaoh, and not the other way around.
This is the time when the Bible texts were being written. The fateful encounter with Necho recalls the confrontation between Moses and the nameless Pharaoh of the Bible. The political present of the Hebrew scholars and the folk memories of the past flow together in the Bible account and merge into a single great epic. The 10 biblical plagues are formed out of experiences and stories from different periods. In the legend that finally emerges, they have changed from natural events into the signs and miracles of God. All the waters turned blood red. Frogs and insects infested the land. Diseases ravaged man and beast. Hailstorms, locust swarms, and sudden darkness followed.
The plagues certainly did not happen within the space of a few days as they're described in the Bible. But every one of the first 9 plagues can be traced back to natural phenomena that existed in Egypt, and to an extent, still exist there today.
There's no scientific explanation for the death of the firstborn. In the religious creation myth of the people of Israel, the 10th plague, together with the Exodus, stands for the future and the freedom promised by God. Scientists have found no proof of the Bible story, but they have found traces of peoples who suffered expulsion and natural disasters, and whose experiences were taken up when folk memories were rewritten as history.